Tucked inside the quiet streets of suburban Oak Haven, the Willow Creek Homeowners Association had always carried an undercurrent of unease. Beneath the manicured lawns and carefully trimmed hedges, disagreements simmered quietly. At the center of most of them stood Karen Whitmore, the unofficial monarch of the neighborhood. As president of the HOA, Karen treated her role less like a volunteer position and more like a throne. Regulations were her oxygen, and enforcing them was her daily ritual. Whether it was the approved shade of beige for mailboxes or the precise measurement of Christmas wreaths, Karen governed Willow Creek with relentless authority. Some neighbors admired her dedication, many quietly resented it, but no one openly opposed her until 62-year-old widower Jim Bennett decided to plant a small vegetable garden in his front yard. Jim's garden was simple and harmless. A handful of tomato vines, a patch of basil, and perhaps a couple of pepper plants growing in neat rows. To most, it added charm. To Karen, it was outright defiance. She insisted the garden violated Willow Creek's landscaping codes and demanded it be removed immediately. Jim politely refused, maintaining that he had reviewed the bylaws and found no such restriction. That refusal marked the beginning of something far more serious. Within a matter of weeks, Karen escalated the situation by initiating formal action through the HOA. She pushed for fines, late penalties, and eventually moved to place a lien against Jim's property. What Karen failed to fully consider was that Jim Bennett was not merely a retired man tending vegetables to pass the time. Before retirement, he had practiced civil law for decades. He understood statutes, procedures, and most importantly, when something wasn't right. As the dispute advanced toward mediation, Jim carefully examined the documents the HOA had filed. That was when he noticed something deeply troubling. Attached to the complaint was a form bearing his signature acknowledging the violation and accepting the penalty. There was only one problem: he had never signed it. The signature looked convincing at first glance, but Jim knew his own handwriting. He had spent years signing legal briefs and contracts. This one felt wrong. He quietly reached out to his former law clerk and a trusted notary he had worked with for years. Together, they reviewed the document. Their conclusion was unmistakable. The signature was not authentic. It had been forged. Rather than storming into the next HOA meeting with accusations, Jim chose a more strategic approach. He gathered everything: email chains, certified mail receipts, time-stamped correspondence, and handwriting samples from verified documents. He assembled the evidence methodically, then filed a motion in district court requesting a judicial review of the paperwork the HOA had submitted, specifically the document containing his alleged signature. He did so without public drama, allowing the legal system to take its course. Meanwhile, Karen remained oblivious to the consequences building around her. She continued patrolling the neighborhood with her usual intensity, scolding teenagers for skateboarding near driveways and inspecting lawns with a ruler to ensure compliance. She carried on as though she were untouchable. But the calm would not last. Jim's motion did not languish in bureaucratic delay. The district court, concerned by the allegation of falsified documentation, scheduled a hearing within 2 weeks. When Karen received the summons, she dismissed it as a procedural routine. To her, it was simply another stage where she could assert authority and reinforce HOA standards. What she did not anticipate was the difference between an HOA boardroom and a courtroom. The case was assigned to Judge Evelyn Moore, a jurist known for her strict adherence to procedure and her intolerance for manipulation. On the day of the hearing, Karen arrived dressed in a sharp power suit, flanked by 2 HOA board members, as if preparing for a corporate negotiation. Jim entered alone, carrying a thick folder filled with certified handwriting analysis, documented timelines, printed emails, and an official statement from a licensed notary public. When proceedings began, Judge Moore invited Karen to present her position. With unwavering confidence, Karen launched into a speech about community standards, noncompliance, and her responsibility to protect property values. She spoke rapidly, occasionally interrupting, gesturing vaguely toward the stack of papers before her. She described Jim's garden as unsightly and inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. Then it was Jim's turn. Calm and composed, he distributed copies of the disputed document to the judge and court clerk. He followed with the original version he had actually received blank, unsigned. Methodically, he walked through a detailed timeline, highlighting inconsistencies in dates and formatting. He submitted the notary's written statement affirming that the signature did not belong to him. With each page examined, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. Judge Moore's expression hardened noticeably. "Miss Whitmore," Judge Moore said evenly, tapping the contested document with her pen, "did Mr. Bennett sign this form in your presence?" Karen hesitated briefly before responding. "Of course he did. You are under oath, Miss Whitmore," the judge reminded her. Pause followed. Karen's composure wavered. "Well, he indicated he would sign it. He gave verbal permission. Permission is not equivalent to a signature," Judge Moore replied firmly. At that point, the judge allowed Jim's retained forensic handwriting expert to testify. Using projected enlargements and overlay comparisons, the expert demonstrated clear tracing patterns and inconsistencies between the questioned signature and Jim's verified handwriting samples. The distinctions were precise and undeniable. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The color drained from Karen's face. "This court has absolutely no tolerance for document forgery," Judge Moore stated, her tone measured but unmistakably severe, "particularly in filings submitted to a court of law." Before Karen could attempt further explanation, the judge announced a brief recess. As the gavel lifted, she added pointedly, "Miss Whitmore, you are not to leave the courthouse." Karen remained seated on a wooden bench in the hallway outside the courtroom, her posture rigid. Her carefully manicured fingers tapped nervously against her phone case, the confident rhythm she once carried replaced by uncertainty, echoing through the quiet corridor. Her repeated calls to fellow board members rang endlessly before dropping to voicemail. The allies who once hovered at her side, some intimidated, others eager to stay in her good graces, had abruptly vanished into silence. Inside the courtroom, Judge Moore continued examining the remainder of the material Jim had submitted. What unfolded was deeply incriminating. The forged signature was not an isolated lapse in judgment. Jim had uncovered 3 additional documents from prior HOA disputes over the last year, each bearing a version of his falsified signature. The pattern was undeniable. When the court reconvened, the tension was palpable. The bailiff escorted Karen back to the front of the courtroom. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, deliberately avoiding Jim. Judge Moore's tone was steady but resolute. "This court finds compelling evidence of intentional falsification of legal documents. Miss Whitmore, you not only submitted forged materials to this court, but you did so while asserting legal authority." Karen attempted to interject, but the judge raised her hand to silence her. "This matter extends beyond a civil disagreement. You are hereby remanded into county custody pending formal charges of fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice." A wave of shocked murmurs swept across the room. Karen's composure was shattered. "Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding," she began, her voice unsteady. "Ma'am," the bailiff said firmly, stepping forward. "Please place your hands behind your back." For a brief moment, she stood motionless. Then, slowly, she complied. The metallic snap of handcuffs closing around her wrists echoed sharply in the hushed courtroom. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and landed softly against the floor. Karen Whitmore, the same woman who once cited neighbors for leaving trash bins out an hour too long, was being escorted away in restraints. Residents who had gathered out of curiosity now stared in stunned disbelief as she disappeared through the courtroom doors. Jim released a long breath. He hadn't realized he'd been outside. Word of Karen's arrest spread rapidly. Phones buzzed with notifications. HOA message threads erupted with speculation. Conversations spilled across driveways and sidewalks. For many residents who had quietly endured her rigid oversight, the news brought an unexpected sense of relief. Some were stunned. Others felt a quiet vindication. Within 48 hours, the county prosecutor confirmed that formal charges would be filed. Karen's actions had not only compromised her own standing, but had shaken the integrity of the HOA itself. Emergency meetings were called. An interim president was appointed. Procedures were temporarily suspended pending review. Jim returned home to his front yard. where the tomatoes were ripening beneath the warm July sun. Yet the story did not conclude there. In the weeks following Karen Whitmore's arrest, Willow Creek entered a period of self-examination. The HOA board, suddenly without its longtime president, scrambled to address the legal and administrative fallout she had left behind. Residents demanded transparency and accountability. An independent auditor was hired to review every document Karen had processed during her leadership. What the audit uncovered stunned the neighborhood. Jim had not been her only target. 4 other homeowners had also been subjected to falsified signatures on official documents. Unauthorized liens had been filed. Improper fines had been issued. Meeting minutes had been altered to reflect votes that never occurred. The very structure meant to protect the community had been manipulated into an instrument of personal control. The district attorney's office responded decisively. Karen was charged with 4 counts of forgery, 2 counts of fraud, 1 count of perjury, and 1 count of obstruction of justice. Bail was denied pending trial, with the court citing the extensive scope of forged documents and her demonstrated misuse of authority. Her arrest also ignited broader discussions about HOA governance beyond Willow Creek. Neighboring communities began reviewing their bylaws and enforcement practices. Local media outlets covered the case extensively, dubbing her the tyrant of the cul-de-sac. She became a cautionary tale about unchecked authority within residential associations. As for Jim, his quiet resolve earned newfound respect. Neighbors who once kept a polite distance now greeted him warmly from their porches. He was invited to serve as a legal advisor to the newly restructured HOA board, but he declined with a smile. "I prefer tomatoes over politics," he joked during a neighborhood barbecue hosted in his front yard. The vegetable garden thrived. Inspired by Jim's determination, several families began planting gardens of their own. The once uniform landscape of pristine but impersonal lawns gradually transformed. Peppers, squash, herbs, and raised flower beds added character and color. The rigid uniformity Karen had enforced gave way to individuality and a renewed sense of community spirit. Months later, Karen's trial concluded. She pleaded not guilty, but the forensic evidence and testimony from multiple residents proved overwhelming. The jury's verdict was delivered swiftly, guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 18 months in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation. Civil lawsuits followed from several homeowners, including Jim. For Jim, however, the outcome was never about revenge. It was about principle, because in Willow Creek, justice did not come from intimidation, excessive fines, or forged paperwork. It came from standing firm when it mattered most, even if the stand began with something as simple as a garden bed. If you thought this HOA showdown was intense, just wait until you see what unfolds next in Willow Creek. Be sure to like this story if you believe Jim was right to defend himself. Share your thoughts below. Would you ever trust your HOA again after something like this? And subscribe for more real-life legal battles, neighborhood conflicts, and courtroom drama each week. This isn't fiction. This is accountability.